Driving late at night had become second nature to me. I'd been working as a rideshare driver for over 3 years, and I preferred the night shift. Fewer cars on the road, better tips, and a strange sense of solitude that I had come to appreciate. But every once in a while, you get a ride that sticks with you, burrows under your skin, and refuses to leave. That night was one of them. The request came in a little past 2 a.m., pickup from a small gas station on the edge of town. It was the kind of place that only had one flickering light in the parking lot, the inside dark except for the dim glow of a single cooler in the back. I hesitated for a moment, a sick feeling bubbling in my stomach. Something about it felt off. I pulled in slowly, scanning the lot. No other cars. The store was clearly closed. But there, standing near the door, was my passenger. A tall, gaunt man in an oversized hoodie, the hood pulled low over his face. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, his stance jittery, shifting weight from one foot to the other. I should have canceled. I should have driven off. Instead, I unlocked the doors. He slid into the back seat without a word, the smell of damp fabric and something sharp and metallic clinging to him. I adjusted my mirror to get a look at him, but he was hunched forward, face obscured by shadow. I swallowed hard. Where to? A pause. Then, in a voice too soft for someone his size, he murmured, "Drive." My fingers tightened on the wheel. "I need an address." Silence stretched between us. Then, he slowly leaned forward, just enough for me to see his face in the dim glow of the dashboard. Pale, too pale. Eyes dark and hollowed, mouth barely moving as he spoke again. "Just drive." I didn't argue. I put the car in gear and pulled out onto the empty road. For the first few minutes, he didn't speak. He just sat there, unmoving. Most passengers either scrolled through their phones or stared out the window, but he just watched me. I could feel his gaze in the mirror. I flicked on the radio, anything to cut the tension. The moment the music started, he hissed, "Turn it off." I did. My heart pounded in my chest. I tried to focus on the road, but the weight of his stare made it impossible to ignore. Then, finally, he spoke. "You ever drive someone you shouldn't have?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I forced out a dry chuckle. "I don't think so." He didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned back, exhaling slowly. "You'd know if you did." A cold sweat trickled down my back. The ride stretched on, the silence thick and suffocating. He mumbled to himself occasionally, words too soft for me to catch. At one point, he started whispering an apology over and over, his hands shaking in his lap. I should have pulled over, kicked him out. But fear had glued me to my seat, hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Then, out of nowhere, he snapped upright. "You missed the turn." My stomach dropped. I hadn't missed anything. The GPS clearly showed we were on track. But he was staring at me now, wide-eyed, almost desperate. "Pull over." I hesitated. "Sir, we're almost." Now, a car's headlights appeared behind us. For the first time, his expression changed. His breath hitched, and he shrank back into the seat. The vehicle behind us slowed, its high beams briefly illuminating my passenger's face. And that's when I saw it. His hoodie wasn't just dirty. It was soaked. And it wasn't water. My stomach twisted. The car behind us kept rolling forward. I held my breath, praying it wouldn't stop. And then, just as the headlights swept past my window, he dove forward, grabbing my wrist with ice-cold fingers. "You need to keep driving," he whispered. Now, my heart slammed against my ribs. I looked in the mirror. The car behind us had stopped. And the driver. He was standing outside, staring right at us. The man standing outside my car didn't move. He just stood there, watching. The headlights cast his face in harsh light, making it impossible to see his features. My passenger's grip tightened on my wrist, his breath shallow and fast. "Drive." I hesitated, torn between the unknown threat inside my car and the one outside. But something in my gut screamed that whatever was happening here was bigger than me. The man outside took a step forward. That was all I needed. I slammed my foot on the gas. My old sedan jerked forward, tires skidding against the pavement before catching traction. The headlights behind us grew smaller in the mirror. I didn't look back. For a moment, I thought I was safe. Then my passenger exhaled a slow, shaking breath. "He's not going to let you go that easy." I didn't respond. My hands were locked around the steering wheel, knuckles bone white. "Turn here," he muttered. I glanced at the GPS. The next turn led into a narrow back road, one that twisted into the dense woods beyond town. It was the kind of road that didn't lead anywhere but trouble. "No." His head snapped up. "Turn. Now." I ignored him, gripping the wheel tighter. The road stretched out ahead, empty. The only sound was the steady hum of my tires against the asphalt. I didn't know what kind of nightmare I'd been dragged into, but I wasn't about to let some blood-soaked stranger tell me where to go. Then, a flash of movement in the mirror. My stomach lurched. The car from before, the man who had been standing in the road, was behind us again. But there was no sound, no rumble of an engine. It was just there, keeping pace with me. No headlights, no driver visible, just an empty, shadowy silhouette behind the wheel. I couldn't breathe. My body screamed at me to go faster, to get as far away as possible. But my passenger let out a sharp breath. "If you speed up, he'll follow," he murmured. "If you stop, he'll take you." I swallowed hard. "What do you mean, take me?" His fingers dug into his knees. "Just drive steady. Normal." My pulse hammered in my ears. Every nerve in my body screamed to floor it, to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever was tailing us. But I did as he said. 35 miles per hour. Not too fast, not too slow. I chanced another glance in the mirror. The car was still there, drifting behind me like a phantom. And then, the shadow in the driver's seat moved. Not like a person adjusting their position. Not like a normal, living thing. It stretched, unfolded. Long, jagged limbs emerging from the dark, pressing against the windshield from the inside. I let out a sharp breath. "What the hell is that?" My passenger didn't answer. His face was pale, eyes locked straight ahead. The thing behind us pressed its hands against the glass, fingers too long, joints bending at impossible angles. Then it grinned. I didn't see a mouth. Not at first. But the longer I stared, the more the darkness shifted, lips curling back to reveal jagged teeth. A sound rumbled through the car. Not from my engine, not from the road, but from inside my head. A low, vibrating hum, crawling behind my eyes, settling deep in my skull. I clutched the wheel, nausea rolling through me. "Don't listen to it," my passenger whispered. "Don't look at it." Easy for him to say. The humming grew louder. My vision blurred at the edges, my limbs going numb. It wasn't just a sound, it was something else. Something prying inside me, digging into my thoughts, whispering things I couldn't understand. My fingers slipped on the wheel. My passenger moved fast. Too fast. In one sharp motion, he reached forward, grabbed my face, and forced my head forward. "Don't." His voice was sharper this time. More urgent. I gasped, sucking in air like I'd just broken through the surface of deep water. The nausea faded. The hum softened. But the thing behind us was still there. And it was getting closer. My passenger let go, exhaling a slow breath. "We have one shot at losing him." I didn't ask what heat was. I didn't want to know. I just nodded. "See that road up ahead?" He pointed. A barely visible side path, more of a break in the trees than a road. "You're going to turn. Fast. Then kill the lights and stop." I clenched my jaw. "And if it sees us?" He didn't answer. The moment arrived. I yanked the wheel to the right, tires skidding across gravel as we veered onto the narrow path. The second we were in the trees, I killed the headlights and slammed the brakes. The car lurched, throwing us forward. Then, silence. I held my breath. The road behind us was empty. No shadow. No car. Just darkness. For a moment, I thought it had worked. Then, ever so slowly, my passenger turned his head and whispered, "Don't look at the window." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't move, didn't blink. And then, a long, thin finger tapped against the glass. Story 2. I used to love the quiet. The city had been too much for me, too many people, too much noise, too many things that could go wrong in a moment's notice. So when I found the listing for a remote cabin buried deep in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, it felt like fate. A place where the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the distant call of birds. No sirens, no shouting, no sudden bursts of sound that made my skin crawl. Just silence. I moved in late September, the air already carrying the crisp promise of autumn. The cabin was small but solid, built decades ago with thick wooden beams and a sturdy stone fireplace. It had a porch that faced the trees, a narrow dirt road leading up to it, and, most importantly, no neighbors for miles. At least, that's what I thought. The first night was perfect. I fell asleep to the sound of rain against the roof, wrapped in the kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. The second night, too, was uneventful. But on the third night, the knocking started. 3 sharp raps against the wooden door. I jolted awake, heart slamming in my chest. The clock by my bedside glowed 2:17 a.m. I sat up slowly, straining to listen. The wind whispered through the trees, the forest shifting softly in the dark. Another knock. It wasn't frantic or aggressive, just 3 steady taps, like someone politely waiting to be let in. I grabbed the flashlight by my bed and padded to the front door, every step slow and measured. Through the small glass pane in the door, I saw nothing but darkness. No figures, no shapes, just trees. I waited, breath held. The silence stretched on. Maybe it was just the wind, I told myself. I didn't open the door. By morning, the knocking felt like a dream, something half-remembered, blurred around the edges. I shook it off and went about my day, chopping firewood and setting up the old generator that came with the place. That night, the knocking came again. 3 precise knocks. Same time, same rhythm. I was ready this time. I yanked open the door, flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The porch was empty. The trees stood still. Not even a breeze rustled the branches. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the ground. The rain from earlier had left the dirt soft, perfect for footprints. But there were none. Whoever had knocked, if anyone had knocked, hadn't left a trace. A chill crept up my spine. I went back inside and locked the door. The next morning, I found something on my porch. A single stone. Small, smooth, placed perfectly in the center of the wooden boards. It hadn't been there the night before. I bent down, picking it up with shaky fingers. It was cold to the touch, damp from the morning dew. I turned it over in my palm, searching for something, anything, that might explain it. Nothing. Just a plain, unremarkable stone. I tossed it into the trees and went back inside. That night, the knocking didn't come. Neither did the night after that. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe it was over. That maybe it had been some trick of my overtired mind, or the house settling in ways I hadn't yet learned to recognize. Then, on the 6th night, something changed. I woke up at exactly 2:17 a.m. Not to knocking, but to silence. Heavy silence. The kind that made my ears ring, like the entire world was holding its breath. I turned onto my side, blinking groggily at the window above my bed. The moonlight was pale, casting soft shadows against the curtains. And then, a face appeared. I sucked in a breath, body locking up with cold, primal terror. It was pressed against the glass, staring in at me. Pale, hollow eyes. A too wide mouth. Its skin was stretched too tight, like it barely fit over the bones beneath. For a long, horrible moment, we just stared at each other. Then, impossibly slow, it raised one hand and knocked. 3 times. I shot out of bed, stumbling backward, my chest heaving with ragged breaths. My mind was screaming, don't look, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. It wasn't outside. It was inside the window. My stomach dropped. That wasn't possible. The window didn't open. It was sealed shut, old nails rusted into the wood. And yet, it pressed a thin, skeletal finger against the glass, grinning. Then, in a voice like dry leaves scraping against pavement, it whispered, "You put the stone in the wrong place." I couldn't move. The thing behind the glass kept staring, its hollow eyes locked onto mine, the too wide grin carved into its face like something out of a nightmare. "You put the stone in the wrong place." The words scraped through the air, dry and brittle, as if they hadn't been spoken in years. I felt something in my chest tighten, a cold pressure that made it hard to breathe. I willed myself to move, to do anything, but my body wouldn't listen. Then, slowly, its long fingers pressed against the glass. Not on the outside. From within, a hairline crack splintered across the window pane. That was enough to break my paralysis. I scrambled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. My brain fought to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Glass didn't crack from inside a window that had never been opened. But the figure was still there, watching me, waiting. I did the only thing I could think of. I bolted out of the bedroom, slamming the door behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps, heart hammering against my ribs. I fumbled for my phone, fingers shaking too hard to grip it properly. No signal. Of course. I backed away from the bedroom door, expecting, dreading the sound of it opening. But nothing happened. Silence. The house felt impossibly still. And then, a sound. Not knocking. Not footsteps. Something. Scraping. It started softly, a whisper of movement against the wooden floorboards. Then it grew louder. Closer. I turned, my eyes locking onto the hallway. The bedroom door was still shut. But the sound wasn't coming from there. It was coming from the front porch. I inched toward the living room, pulse thrumming in my ears. The front door had a small window, just high enough that you had to step up to see through it. I didn't want to look, but I had to. Slowly, I moved toward the door, my body tight with dread. My reflection wavered in the dark glass as I stepped up, and then I saw it. A hand. Not human. Too long. Too thin. The fingers were bent at strange angles, the skin pale and stretched over sharp knuckles. It was dragging something across the porch, a slow, deliberate motion. A stone. My stomach twisted. The same kind of stone that had appeared on my porch days ago. It lifted the stone, holding it between its spindly fingers. Then, as if sensing my presence, the hand paused. The fingers flexed. And then, it knocked. 3 slow, deliberate taps. I stumbled back, my breath hitching in my throat. My mind raced, grasping for any logical explanation, but there was none. I needed to get out. Now. My car keys were on the kitchen counter. I lunged for them, snatching them up just as another knock echoed through the house. I wasn't going to wait to see what happened next. I bolted for the door. The second I twisted the lock, a voice whispered from the other side. "Don't go out." I froze, not because of the words, but because the voice wasn't its. It was mine. The sound of my own voice, distorted and hollow, coming from the other side of the door. Cold terror washed over me, my hand trembling against the doorknob. I had to leave. I had to. I yanked the door open, and the world was wrong. Not just dark. Empty. The trees, the dirt road, the sky itself, it was all gone. Nothing but a vast, endless black stretching out in every direction. Like the universe had been erased. And standing in the middle of it, the figure, waiting, grinning. Its arms were outstretched, dozens of stones balanced in its bony fingers, each one carved with symbols I didn't recognize. And then, slowly, deliberately, it dropped them, one by one. A ringing sound filled the air, vibrating deep in my skull, making my vision blur. The pressure in my chest tightened, a suffocating weight dragging me downward. I staggered back, gasping for air. My foot hit the threshold of the cabin, and suddenly, everything snapped back into place. The trees, the road, the sky. I was standing in my doorway, heart pounding, the night perfectly still around me. No figure, no stones, just silence. Shaking, I slammed the door and locked it. My body felt heavy, my mind spinning with the impossible. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. When dawn finally came, I packed a bag, left the cabin, and never looked back. I don't know what it wanted. I don't know what would have happened if I had stepped outside. But I do know one thing. The next owner of that cabin will find something waiting for them. A single, smooth stone, left on the porch, exactly where it's supposed to be. Story 3. I never wanted to come back to Black Hollow. No one ever really left this town, not entirely. Sure, you could pack up, move to the city, start fresh. But Black Hollow had a way of sinking its claws into people, dragging them back when they least expected it. For me, it was my sister. Evelyn went missing 3 weeks ago. I hadn't spoken to her in almost a year. We weren't exactly on good terms, but that didn't mean I wanted her to vanish. When my mother called, her voice tight with exhaustion, I knew what she was going to say before she even got the words out. "She's gone, Theo." The police had no leads, no witnesses. One minute she was walking home from her night shift, the next, she was nowhere. Her apartment door was locked from the inside. Her car still sat in the driveway. It was like she had just evaporated. But I knew better. Black Hollow ate people, and sometimes it spat them back out in ways you didn't want to see. I drove back into town just after midnight. The highway had been empty, the radio nothing but static, and by the time I crossed the familiar rusted "Welcome to Black Hollow" sign, the dread had settled deep into my bones. I told myself I'd only stay for a few days. Talk to the cops, look through her apartment, make sure my mother wasn't losing her mind. Then I'd be gone. That was the plan. But plans never worked out in this town. Evelyn's apartment was exactly as she had left it. Neat, quiet, untouched. No signs of forced entry. Nothing missing. But there was something off the second I stepped inside. The air was wrong. Too thick. Too still. Like the apartment had been holding its breath. I checked every room, every closet, even under the bed. But she wasn't there. Of course she wasn't. I was about to leave when I saw it. The notebook. It sat on the kitchen counter, black leather bound, open to a page near the middle. The handwriting was Evelyn's, sharp, neat, precise. But the words, they made my skin crawl. "It knows when you're looking. It knows when you're awake. If you hear it whisper your name, pretend you didn't. If you see it standing in the doorway, close your eyes. I swallowed hard, flipping back through the earlier pages. Most of it was nonsense, disjointed thoughts, frantic scribbles, half-written warnings. But as I turned the pages, one name appeared over and over again. The Watcher. My stomach nodded. I had heard that name before. Everyone in Black Hollow had. I shut the notebook, pulse hammering. It was just paranoia. Evelyn had always been a little eccentric. Maybe she had scared herself into believing something that wasn't real. But as I stood there, the apartment silent around me, a noise drifted in from the bedroom. A slow, rhythmic tapping. I turned, breath catching in my throat. It was coming from the closet. Tap, tap, tap. A cold sweat prickled along my spine. I took a step closer. The closet door was slightly ajar, the sliver of darkness behind it yawning and deep. Tap, tap, tap. I reached out, fingers brushing against the handle. The moment I touched it, the tapping stopped. Silence swallowed the room. I stood there, heart thundering, waiting. Then, a whisper, right by my ear. Theo. I ran. Didn't look. Didn't breathe. I grabbed my keys and tore out of the apartment, the notebook clutched in my shaking hands. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, doors locked, headlights spilling weakly into the empty parking lot. I tried to catch my breath, tried to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe it had been the wind. Maybe it had been my mind playing tricks on me. Then I looked down at the notebook. It was open to a different page now. A fresh sentence, scrawled in Evelyn's unmistakable handwriting. If you hear it whisper your name, pretend you didn't. A lump formed in my throat. I hadn't pretended. And now, as I sat there in my locked car, I could feel it. Something watching me from the apartment window. I should have driven away. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to burn rubber down the highway and never look back. But my hands wouldn't move, my fingers clenched around the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I could still feel it. A presence, heavy and suffocating, staring at me from Evelyn's apartment window. I didn't dare look, but I knew it was there. I forced myself to breathe, to think. What the hell was happening? Evelyn had been writing about something. The Watcher. Some kind of presence, something she believed was following her. And now it was following me. I turned the key in the ignition. The car rumbled to life. The apartment door slammed open. I barely bit back a scream. My pulse jackhammered as I snapped my head up, my eyes locking onto the gaping doorway. It was dark inside. No movement. No sound. Just an open door where there hadn't been one before. I threw the car into reverse, tires screeching as I shot backward out of the lot. My breath came in ragged gasps, hands trembling on the wheel. I wasn't staying. Not another second. I sped through the empty streets of Black Hollow, my mind racing. I needed answers. I needed to know what the hell Evelyn had gotten herself into. And there was only one place I could go. The house we grew up in. My mother's place was on the outskirts of town, nestled between the thick woods that stretched for miles in every direction. She had lived there since before we were born, and I hadn't stepped foot inside since I left Black Hollow years ago. The sight of it in the rearview mirror made my stomach twist. It looked smaller than I remembered. Colder. Like it had been waiting for me to return. I pulled into the driveway, cutting the engine. The porch light was off. The curtains drawn. I hesitated before stepping out. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees, whispering through the long grass. I glanced toward the tree line and froze. A figure stood just beyond the edge of the woods. Tall, still, watching me. I sucked in a breath, my body locking up. I couldn't make out its face, couldn't tell if it was even facing me, but somehow I knew it was looking right at me. A surge of cold terror rolled through me, and I forced myself to move, to run toward the house. My keys fumbled at the lock, and for one heart-stopping moment, I thought I wouldn't get inside in time. Then, the doors swung open. I stumbled in, slamming it shut behind me. My chest heaved as I pressed my back against the wood, my ears straining for any sound outside. Silence. Then, a soft knock, right against the door. My entire body went rigid. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't aggressive. Just 3 soft, deliberate knocks, like it was politely waiting to be let in. I squeezed my eyes shut. No. I turned and bolted up the stairs. The house was silent, too silent. It felt hollow, like it had been emptied of something that should have been there. I reached my mother's room, throwing the door open. She was sitting up in bed, staring straight ahead. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, locked on something that wasn't there. I hesitated. Mom. She didn't respond. Her lips moved, barely a whisper. I stepped closer, my stomach twisting. "Mom, what?" Then I heard it. The whisper. So soft. So careful. "Theo." I staggered back. My mother's lips weren't moving anymore. But the whisper was still there, right next to my ear. My heart slammed against my ribs. And then, my mother's head snapped toward me. Her mouth opened. Wider. Wider. Too wide. And in a voice that was both hers and not hers, she whispered, "You should not have looked." The lights went out. Darkness swallowed the room, thick and absolute. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then, in the silence, I heard it. Footsteps. Moving toward me. I turned. And standing in the doorway. Tall. Still. Hollow eyes staring. The Watcher. It had finally found me.